Hello, for today's lecture, we're going to be talking about qualitative and quantitative research and the relationship between the two. And so, for starters, quantitative methodologies focus on how many and how much. We're looking at quantities of things. And so, to begin a quantitative study, you need to have a clear idea of what to measure and how the questionnaires should be designed. And so, when we talk a little bit further about survey research or content analysis, we're going to talk a bit about how we choose a sample and what conclusions can be made based on the sample size that we have and who we've chosen to survey and the questions that were asked. But for now, it's important to keep in mind that when you're doing quantitative work, you're learning a little about a lot. And so you're interested in numbers and kind of a broad overview. Meanwhile, qualitative methods try to answer how or why. And so one thing to keep in mind when thinking about study design for interviews or focus groups is that we often have a hard time determining why. We don't always know our motivations. We don't always know why we do things. How might be a better question to think about. And so when we're doing qualitative work, we need a clear idea of what questions to ask and who we should be asking them of. And so the strength of qualitative work is going to be based on linking the right questions with the right people to get the answers that you need to conclude your study. And so some general methods that fall under each category. For qualitative work, we're talking about in-depth interviews. Individual interviews used to gather rich insight from respondents. We're also looking at focus groups. These are, if anyone's ever participated in a market research study, you've done a focus group. They bring people together and ask them to discuss a topic, whether it's a product or a particular social challenge or the like. It's a group interview design. We also do field observations, and so we observe people's behavior and reactions. We might go somewhere. So one of my favorite examples of this is retail ethnography, where people spend time at shopping malls and look at how people move through stores. And then another qualitative research method is textual analysis. And so you might watch media and look for trends or themes in the content. And meanwhile, quantitative work, you're looking at surveys, right? So numerically coded reports that respondents have filled out themselves, demonstrating their knowledge, attitudes, opinions, and behavior. We also have observation and content analysis. So we're numerically coding observed behavior, events, or media content. And experimental research. And those are studies under controlled conditions. And so thinking about the paradigms that we discussed in our last lesson, you can see how the worldview shifts, right? And each methodology makes sense given a particular worldview. And so one of the reasons I started off talking about paradigms as worldviews is that I think it should help understand kind of the validity and the approach that each method has and how we can apply them together and think about how to link that back to theory and our secondary research. Right, so some general characteristics to keep in mind. Qualitative work is non-numeric. We're looking for deep-seated insights into human behavior and beliefs. We're asking questions such as why and how. And then the study that you do and the write-up that you give it is going to be detailed and descriptive. And the strength of qualitative work is often evaluated based on the detail provided. And one of the terms is thick description. You're looking to really kind of put people in a place and time and generate that sort of like rich tapestry of, evocative experience. And you're learning a lot about a little. And so in qualitative work, if you're doing in-depth interviews, due to time limitations, you might only have, 5 to 10 interviews, depending on your study. But you're going to really, if you spend 2 hours talking to someone, you get a lot of information. And so you don't have a broad section of the population that you've studied, but you do have very deep, comprehensive information from the people that you spoke with. In quantitative work, it's numeric. We're dealing with numbers, and we're measuring things. We're measuring attitudes, opinions, behavior, and so on. And it's designed to generalize from a sample to a larger population. And we're going to talk more in a few slides about generalizability. But the idea is that you can take work from a quantitative study, replicate it, and you'd have the same results, and that you could also therefore apply it to other people who weren't studied, and you assume that they would act the same way. And so this is kind of where quantitative research and a positivist paradigm really link up, because if we remember, positivism looks to establish kind of law-like functions in human behavior, as if it were a hard science study. And so limited information is collected, right? So in a long interview, an in-depth interview, you might get a lot of information. You're not sure. Some of it's relevant to your question, other stuff isn't. But with quantitative work, it's very narrowed and isolated towards measures. And the quickest way to remember it is you're learning a little about a lot. And so the information you get isn't as in-depth about individuals, but you have a larger sample size that you're working with. And so Flick, in the chapter that you read for this lesson, provides some examples of designs that link the two. And so this is a chart taken from the text, and he's looking at, some ways that you could combine the two. And Flick's argument is really that a combination of both, and that's how we approach it in this class, is going to be the strongest methodological choice for a particular study. And so you're looking at, you could either collect both sorts of data continuously throughout the study. You could use your qualitative work to inform different eras of quantitative work. And so you might have, when we talk about study design, this will become a little bit more clear, but you've got, you might do a survey at the beginning of the study, do some qualitative research, either field work or interviews, and come up with a redesigned survey design. And by the third wave that Flick has listed here, you have further refined your survey or quantitative experimental design. And then a third way of doing this would be to use qualitative research at the beginning of your study when you're in the exploratory stages. And then you would use quantitative research to develop a questionnaire. And then with qualitative work, you might go back and do in-depth interviews using the information you got from your questionnaires as a guide on the questions to ask. You'd identify from your survey results what information you want to get more of, and then you would ask for that in interviews. And then otherwise, you might do it in the reverse order. You might have a survey that then informs your field study, and then you might end with an experiment. And so those are 4 different ways that you can kind of think about how the different methods fit together. And if we think about methods as tools in a particular toolkit, or pieces of a puzzle that are going to help us answer our research question, you can see different ways that they can flow together here. And so some things to keep in mind, qualitative and quantitative methods can be used at different stages in the research process. We often use qualitative work for exploration. And so exploratory work is the work we do before we really develop our research question and study design. And so we're looking to gather, general information about the topic we're interested in, maybe develop a hypothesis, and then we would test that by quantitative methods. Another concept that Flick introduces is that of triangulation. And it's a combination of several different methods that are chosen to complement each other. And so essentially, these designs that he has, where he lays out how you can link qualitative and quantitative work, these are triangulated designs. And the idea is that they're stronger together. You're taking advantage of methodologies, each methodology's strengths and weaknesses. And so methods have been chosen to help extract meaning, and it allows the researcher to clarify different facets of the approach. And so you get a fuller view. And you're also accounting for the blind spots of each method. And so as we talked about when we discussed paradigms, each paradigm has, criticisms of it. And each methodology similarly there's a critique about its usefulness and what it does and does not address. And so a triangulated approach really works to kind of bridge those gaps and provide a more holistic view. And so talking again about the combination of qualitative and quantitative work, You can either do them autonomously, so have a quantitative study about the topic and a qualitative study about the topic, or do them simultaneously, side by side. You want to, no particular method is preliminary or superior. And so when you're doing a well-designed triangulated study, the methods kind of hold their own within the work, each method playing an equal role in the project. And so you might survey, Flick gives an example of looking at, you begin with a survey of caregivers in a hospice situation and establish themes for your research. So that's a quantitative role. And then you'd conduct interviews and case studies. And then you might, look at the similarities and differences between survey results and what came up in your interviews and case studies. And so if we were to move from qualitative work to quantitative work, you're looking at observations and analyzing them for frequency. And so what Flick's explaining here is oftentimes, if you were to do a qualitative observational study, you might analyze your data by counting things, and that's transferring it into a quantitative paradigm. And so you're making an argument about your qualitative data based on quantitative logic. The flip side of this is when you're doing quantitative research, in your study design, but then using a qualitative analysis. And Flick says that this is more difficult. One way of doing this, or an example, would be to contextualize survey answers. And then you'd need to use additional methods such as interviews. Open-ended survey questions are another example of a quantitative method that then kind of moves into a qualitative analysis. And so combinations of the two, you want to link the results of research on the same project. And so this is what we're going to be doing throughout the semester. And the goals are, you want to expand your knowledge of the issue under study and mutually validate the findings. And so again, we've got the triangulation of methodologies kind of strengthening the result. And so some possible outcomes, the results might confirm each other and support the same conclusion. Or the results could focus on different aspects of the issue, but be complementary. And kind of the most troubling would be if your results are contradictory. And that might lead you to reformulate your study and kind of re-engage with the question and think about what the contradictions might be pointing to. And so finally, we're going to talk about some criteria for validity. How do you know a study is good and that the results are solid? And so there's two important general criteria. One is reliability, and that's the idea that the results must be more than a one-off. And if the study were to be conducted again, using the same design, the results would be the same. The other criteria is validity, and we're looking at whether the results meet the requirements of the scientific research method. And so internal validity is the question of, is the study well designed? And external validity deals with the idea of generalizability. And that's, again, similar to reliability, right? Would we be able to apply your findings to a wider population? And so to get into the idea of generalizability, because this becomes a difference, a very stark difference between qualitative work and quantitative work. Generalization is really a principle in quantitative research, where you are dealing with large amounts of people and very narrow information that's being gathered, or perhaps experimental research. And again, to use the example of like a medical trial study, you'd want to make sure that the results of that were replicable and generalizable. Scientific validity, though, and generalization as a goal don't really fit qualitative research's principles and practices. And so if you're conducting 5 to 10 interviews, in-depth interviews with someone, you're going to be really limited in the claims you can make. You're going to be able to make very strong claims about the interviews you've done, and there's a certain amount of universality available through that. But the general criteria that quantitative research uses isn't going to be applicable to qualitative research. And so we have to meet each method on its own grounds. And so quantitative, the validity is based on the number of cases studied. And with qualitative work, the validity is based on how you can link your findings back to theory. And then again, the quality of your sampling decisions. Did you ask the right questions of the right people to uncover the information you're looking for? And so often quantitative criteria is applied to qualitative work, and this is a mistake. You're really kind of not using the strengths of each research methodology to its greatest capacity because they don't fit with qualitative research's goals and practices. And so ultimately, the criteria for validity should be based on the methodological choices, research design, and the strength of the conclusions. And that's the end of our lecture, looking at how we can link quantitative and qualitative work together. We're going to be discussing the steps in the research process next, and so stay tuned. Oh my God, did I just somehow